I'm having these conversations to try and offer a conversation, sort of creating resource that can explore some of the challenges in the field, really, in order that we can share it out with the wider movement. Because of all the work I'm doing on the grassroots, trying to support a project called the Humanity Project to get people to set up their own assemblies. At the same time, we want diverse participation, and we want to make sure that they don't feel like they've been sort of led by the nose. And I think one of the answers to the question is this potentially in the concept of integrity, which was so helpful for you to suggest, Claire, that there's something else that we could talk about that's not called the pretense of being a neutral person.
When I was facilitating at citizens' assemblies, one of the assembly members who had been selected by sortition is actually a leading academic in deliberative democracy, and that some of you know, John Boswell. And I was facilitating the deliberation, and he was at my table. And so I felt very much on the spot in that process. And I was constantly reflecting back on my practice. And also I was observing probably a lot more than I would normally, because I knew he was there as a citizen engaged in the process, but also as an academic. He published a piece called Seeing Like a Citizen, which I think is fascinating because it's his explanation of his experience as an assembly member through the lens of the academic. And he was raising lots of issues that he had observed in the process around treating people in a way that was quite neutral and not doing justice to the power asymmetries, for instance, between assembly members, and how that was creating some sense of awkwardness. All these questions we're grappling with around neutrality of processes and power asymmetries. So that was my first kind of reckoning with this question. And then it kept coming back, surfacing in other processes.
20 minutes into our first demo, there was a level of genuine curiosity and open-mindedness that started showing up that was really mind-blowing to me. And all that the facilitator seemed to be doing was listening deeply to each person, empathizing and reflecting back what they were hearing, while also writing it down on a large flip chart paper. And so I later learned that in family therapy, this approach is called multidirectional partiality, but I really prefer to think of it much more simply as taking all sides. And ever since then, it seems clear to me that as facilitators, we're not machines, and it doesn't make sense to pretend to be. And it's also clear to me that the listening work we do, it's often taken for granted because it is invisible, but in fact, it is essential. There's an energy in listening, in presence, in caring, and those things are not often considered when we look at what it is that facilitators do. So I think we need to care about everybody rather than not care about anybody.
My first experiences of facilitation were as part of the student movement in Spain in the early 2000s. For 4 months, students took over Spanish universities, most of them, tried to demonstrate how the university could work differently. And a key element of that was to create assemblies. So in my university, we had the faculty assemblies and the popular assembly. So it soon became clear that there was going to be a need for some of us to step back a little bit and hold the space so that others could work through their disagreements. I was studying political science. I was all about talking and persuading others and debating, which comes from debatire, to beat down. So you learn to beat down your opponents. And it's taken probably 20 years to begin to unlearn some of those habits, which is another journey of facilitators, I guess. But for me, that was the first time when I began to appreciate this dilemma of neutrality and impartiality, because on the one hand, impartiality was important, because otherwise I couldn't gain the trust of different parts of the movement. Part of the deal we made is that all the student unions put down their flags, and it became a genuine assembly movement where everything we did was through assemblies, not through factions or unions attached to parties, etc. Impartiality was important, but neutrality was an absolute no-go, because your job as a facilitator is to intervene, especially to disrupt some of the power inequalities that shape group dynamics. Context is really going to matter in this conversation, because it is undeniable that our practices are guided by values. That is not in question. One of my big issues with deliberative democratic theory is that it's so focused on procedures and proceduralism that, just to put it simply, you cannot deliberate on a dead planet and you cannot deliberate with a roof over your head and an empty stomach. So to me, a lot of the work I'm doing now is trying to see what have we lost along the way from the strand of participatory democracy that cared about the socioeconomic conditions that then enable good deliberation. And I think we need to recover that. So there's no neutrality in values, but those values need to be agreed. And then we need to hold the spaces where multiple perspectives and values can be brought in conversation.
One thing I wanted to say was this piece about context that's came up, because the idea that a facilitator's job is to be sort of neutral is sort of similar to the idea of them being even-handed or sort of taking all of the sides. But then it's quite different to the idea of them interrupting something in order to make the situation more equitable or more fair for somebody or easier for somebody to be part of it. That feels like it's a big word to put in their context, and especially in current British politics. Well, similarly, what we've seen going on in America, in my view, is this sort of destruction of the possibility of context and nuance. And if you really make that impossible to sort of find, then you also somehow, you sort of feel like you live in a much more oversimplified version of reality. And so when we're working on the ground, what I'm trying to work out is how would we help some people in one place to set up an assembly process versus in a different place where they're very, very different contexts.
One of my main influences, actually, when I first started in that community development was Paulo Freire, the adult educationalist. And that really has impacted my way I understand power. And I think, to me, if you're coming into facilitation, you've got to have some theory of power and a theory of change too. And to my mind, that informs the way you design process, but also the way you show up. And that shows up in your micro practices as well as the macro. And I suppose for me, I often find myself working with dilemmas and tensions and differences. It's very much about how, as a facilitator, that you hold those and not to kind of collapse into one or the other, because that's where polarization happens. But in holding that, something new might emerge, a third way potentially. But it's being able to hold that space long enough. And I think that's where I often find the tension in citizens' assemblies, because there is this need to kind of get to producing recommendations when actually some of that much deeper work where you can really start to surface some of the differences that are keeping messy, complex issues stuck aren't really allowed to come through. Where you have more space, you get a balance between the critical thinking that's needed, but also working with all aspects, the head, the heart, the body, creativity, being able to really bring different ways of knowing in. I think the choices we make are fateful, really, in terms of where processes end up. I think neutrality, yeah, we can't do neutrality.
Something that we haven't really brought up here is the whole question of trauma, right? And healing, and where does polarization come from? Somebody was talking about citizens' assemblies as depolarization machines. I know a lot of people, it's like, well, we want to come up with a good law and then make the government implement it because we want to deal with this climate situation, and that's all very valid. But in addition, I don't know how familiar people are with deep canvassing. We have a lot of evidence that what is it that allows people to be in a situation where they actually reconsider and change their mind. We know that if we have a small group where everybody has the opportunity to be heard and everybody will be heard in that kind of non-judgmental atmosphere, that's when people actually open their minds and change and shift. And there are incredibly powerful stories that we have of people who have, made significant shifts as a result of not getting shut down.
But if this discussion is partly because we're all trying to create more democratic systems and processes, and I'm personally trying to reimagine how you could run society in a way which actually feels democratic and kind and doesn't self-terminate or turn into fascism. But it strikes me that actually if you have these kinds of processes with people, they become politicized. The power that they often don't have, it seems to me, is the power that I always complain about, because I didn't go to a posh school. So I didn't get taught how to do debates, and I didn't get taught how to do public speaking. And I have learned how to take up space and be quite noisy, but only out of necessity, I would say, not because anyone helped me to sort of realize myself as someone who should have a political life.
Rhetorical skills are amongst the most unequally distributed resources in society, because again, it really depends on so many things, from your background, your upbringing, your access to education, and then the spaces where you get to contribute to some equal rhetorical skills. That points to the need for facilitators who try to create a space where those things are not completely distorting of the dynamic that can emerge in a group. Societies as a whole have lost the art of the political ritual of trying to make sense together, and trying to work through things. There are always these compelling stories of individuals who haven't had a chance before and who thrive in this space, although on paper they probably, you wouldn't think they will be very active contributors. We anyone who's been in these spaces, we get captivated by these but in a way, what that speaks of is our, how we've lost the understanding that these are actually human qualities that we have been suppressing because of all kinds of structural forces. Now, there's a lot of critique that this is an imposition from the global north. I don't buy it. The history of facilitation, the history of deliberations as old as humanity, it belongs across the world. And archaeologists and anthropologists now are beginning to kind of show and tell a different story of how human communities self-organized and developed and so on. And facilitators have been there ever since there have been power inequalities within groups.
Are citizens' assemblies supporting the system or are they challenging the system? And you can have something that can be a bit of a Trojan horse. It grows inside the system and maybe it's helping the system in some ways, but then maybe it's also opening some room for something new to happen beyond the system. And so how it's not necessarily an either or, that something is either helping the system or it's challenging the system, right? Back to the topic we started, though, this whole thing about how do we gain legitimacy? How do we gain credibility? And this whole question about impartial and what do we want impartial to mean, right? So definitely we don't want to be partial in the sense of we don't want to be favoring one side over another. Clearly, right? That's not going to help. And at the same time, it makes me think, again, to come back to multi-partiality or taking all sides. And it just makes me think of the Occupy phrase, which I'm actually not remembering exactly how it went, but it was something like, rather than we have no leaders, we are all leaders.
I think one of the early things that came up that we didn't talk about very much was about trust and like the fear of losing control. And that's a power question for another day.